And welcome back to the third part of the mini lecture series on survey. So now that we have discussed the type of survey questions formatting and also discussed about in the first part of the mini lecture, talk about the advantages and disadvantages of survey as well as types of survey, now we're going to focus on survey wording. So, one thing that we need to bear in mind is that if a question can be misinterpreted, it will be. So, misinterpretation occurs mostly because a question has been poorly worded and or has not been pre-tested to see what misinterpretations are possible. So that's why for our second and last method project, when you're designing survey questions, I do want you to actually ask people around you, if you are at home with your family members, to take your survey, and that way you can get feedback from them. You can see whether the questions that you have designed are actually interpreted by them the way you want them to be interpreted, or do they have a different interpretation? So if they do have a different interpretation, then one thing that I definitely ask you to do is to rewrite your survey questions so that it's not going to be interpreted by the people who are taking your surveys. And then the next one is we're going to talk about the common problems with wording. So the first one is leading questions. So leading questions force the respondent into an assumption that may not be true. They lead the respondent to a particular answer rather than letting respondents respond in their own terms. Like it or not, this is a common mistake that we often make because we have a certain ideas in our head about what should be the correct answer. And so we tend to lead our respondents by formulating this kind of questions. So for example, why do you enjoy online shopping? So that questions, why do you enjoy online shopping, becomes a leading questions because you have already lead your respondents to think about online shopping as an enjoyable experience. So you don't want to do that. So you want to ask, why do you decide to do online shopping instead of going to the store, for instance? And you have several options that they can choose the one that best match with their reasoning. Another example is, how often are you aware of the misogynist lyrics in rap songs? So here is clearly a leading question because you want your respondents to think of rap songs in a certain way. So please make sure that you take out and be careful of the adjectives that you're using in your questions, because those adjectives tend to try to lead your respondents into thinking about the subject that you're asking in a certain way. Yeah. So when you can, please watch the way you write your questions and edit them before you test them to your family members. And then the next one that is also common is double-barreled questions. So this issue occurs when you ask two questions simultaneously but allow for only one answer. So for example, do you think Instagram is a good platform to shop, or do you just use it to browse for pictures? So what is it that you want to ask? You want to ask about shopping, or do you want to ask about people browsing pictures on Instagram? So you cannot ask two type of different questions in one sentence here. You need to break them down so that you don't fall into that common problems, which is the double-barreled question. Do you think, the second one, rap lyrics are misogynistic, or do you think they are racist? Which one of them are you wanting to get the answer? A or B? So make sure that whenever you formulate your question that you're careful not to make this kind of mistake. And then the next one is framing questions. So this one is similar to leading question. Researchers can influence respondents' answer to question by framing question in a particular way or by question order. For instance, choose adjectives that describe the current U.S. president's performance. Um, you, for instance, especially in the case of dealing with COVID-19, this seems like you're framing your respondents, yeah, to answer a certain way. Another one is, in your opinion, do media affect your assessment of President Trump's performance? Yeah. So you can see by the way the questions are framed that you are wanting your audience, not your audience, your respondent to answer or to respond in a specific manner. So go back and check your agenda and make sure that the questions that you're asking is neutral and not reflecting what it is that you have in mind. Yeah, this is something that also very common. And then next one is negative wording. So whenever possible, avoid phrasing survey questions or statements as negatives. Negative wording may be simple and clear, but still misunderstood by people reading in a hurry. And this is a very common mistake. So even when I'm framing or I'm formulating a question for a test, I try to avoid using negative wording unless I have a specific purpose to do that, because most of the time people are not careful enough to see the word not there. So for example, do you agree or disagree with this statement? Media should not try to form public opinions. The word not there people may skip it and may not read that one. So as a result, the answers that you get may not be as you predicted. And then the second one, a course in media research should not be required as part of media studies major, for instance. People may read it as a course in media research should be required as part of media studies major. You may have to put the word not in capital letters and then bold them if you really want to ask this kind of negative, using negative wording in your question. But I would want you to test these questions on the people that you are living with, maybe your family members, and see whether they're able to answer the questions correctly. And then the double negative. A combination of negative wording and double-barreled questions result in the double negative. Do you think that it is uncommon for news media to publish unflattering stories about President Trump? Oh, this is for sure going to be confusing for your respondent. So I would try my best to avoid formulating this kind of question when I'm creating or designing a survey. The next one is assumptions. So do not assume that your respondents are familiar with your topic. Be generous and clear in providing information and phrasing your questions. Also, whenever you can, avoid the use of jargons and slang unless you are sure that your respondents will understand the terms. For as easy as an issue about online screening platform, many people may not be familiar with that. I know that in your generation, people seem to no longer watch traditional TV and just switch to the online screening platform. But in this case, when you, for instance, want to distribute your survey and includes your grandparents, for instance, to answer them as well, because you want to compare certain age groups in your survey, then you may have to explain clearly all of the terms that you're using in your survey. Now, the guiding respondents to a survey is basically about how you're going to design the order of your questions when you're designing a survey. So you have a choice of either a funnel or an inverted funnel format for overall questionnaire design. So the funnel design begins with broad questions and moves to specific questions, whereas the inverted funnel takes the reverse approach by starting with specific questions and then moving to broader one. So questions related to the same theme should be grouped together, but sometimes a question may be sandwiched between unrelated questions as a check that all questions on the same topic are being answered consistently. And this is a very useful trick, especially if you're asking many questions. You will find that in this second method project that I'm asking you to do, that your question should be less than 15 questions, and that may not, that you may not need to do this kind of sandwiching questions just to check whether they really understand, because your survey is going to be short. And then sensitive questions may be placed among questions with which respondents have a comfort level so that they are more comfortable answering them. You're going to watch a short video that I'm attaching in this discussion forum, and you may want to listen to what the speaker says about asking sensitive questions. All right, basically that is the last part of this mini series on survey. I encourage you to read the chapter, the survey chapter of your textbook, because it provides a much thorough information than the one that I have given here. I try to cover everything and make sure that I touch all the important parts, but I still want you to do the heavy lifting of reading the chapter and start thinking about the topic for your second method project, which use survey as well as interview. Now, at the end of this mini lecture, I have several questions that I want you to answer. But before we go to that section, I want to let you know that some of my students have taken other research courses before, and they talk about how some professors give suggestions of asking the general questions, the demographic questions like age, gender, and all that at the end of the survey, so that the respondents can focus on the topic that are being asked, and then they can end the survey by answering all the general questions. You can do that for sure, and you can also try opening up your survey by asking them to answer these simple questions about gender and age, for instance. So whichever way that you go, I want you to be mindful about how you design the research questions so that the flow of the questions will become make sense for you, and also make sense for the respondents who are taking the survey. All right, so now move on to the lecture check questions. I want you to answer the following questions and submit them in the discussion forum, part 2 of survey, for a full participation grade. I have 4 questions, and the last question is optional. You can answer this question when you have watched the video on 7 tips for good survey questions. I highly recommend you to watch the video because it's only less than 5 minutes, and also it provides very useful tips for you to design your own survey questions. All right, thanks everyone. I am going to end the mini lecture series on survey here, and I'm going to start on talking about a mini lecture series on interview.